Well, I'm Dr. Jill Terry. I'm head of the Division of English and Cultural Studies here at Worcester, and I've been a teacher of Media and Cultural Studies for a few years now, and my input has generally been to the first Level 1 mandatory, which tries to introduce students to the whole theoretical framework for media and cultural studies, and semiotics is one of the top subjects for us in that module.
So firstly, what's meant by the term semiotics?
Well, semiotics is a rather frightening term perhaps, but it is simply the name given to a theory, and it's a theory that came about originally from the study of linguistics, a gentleman called Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, he was interested in the way languages work. Linguistics is the scientific study of language, and that's what he was interested in. So the way in which when we're speaking, the words that we're using are just kind of signs that we get meaning from, and how that operates differently in different cultures. Now, for the purposes of media and cultural studies, the figure who becomes more interesting to us was a gentleman theorist called Roland Barthes. Now, Roland Barthes took that early idea, the study of linguistics, to apply it to our culture and every kind of language system in culture. He saw that you could take any kind of cultural text and look at it, analyse it in quite a systematic way, as if it were a language. So he brought about the study of cultural texts ranging from everything from the wrestling match, for example, to a packet of soap powder. Roland Barthes argued that everything was a text made up of a system of signs which we could read. So, for example, you could study body language from the point of view of semiotics, so that you could look at the way I'm sitting now and the kinds of expressions I'm using, as if what's going on here is a language made up of a system of signs, that if you are culturally proficient in the way body language is operating in Worcester in May, if you like, you will be able to read my body language as a component of signs, so studying it as if it's a linguistic system. So semiotics is that academic practice of studying languages of every kind of cultural text, from music to, as I say, to body language, to adverts, to television programs, as if it can be read in a systematic way.
What do we mean by signs?
Right, now it gets more difficult, because when we think about this semiotic language, we think about the way we're analysing cultural texts to see what they're made up of. How do we read a cultural text? How do we read body language? We read it through a system of signs. So my smile is a particular sign which conveys certain meanings. It could have a range of meanings within the sign system of facial expression. So a kind of happy, relaxed smile can mean that I'm a very open person, I'm open to you, but I could have a different kind of smile which you, being a reader of the system of body language, would be able to understand. So when we think about these sign systems, we can think about all kinds of languages that operate in our culture, and one that is very often given as an example in text for students is the system of the traffic light. Now, if we think about our traffic control systems, they work as a language. There is no earthly reason why a yellow line should be drawn down the side of a road to indicate that you shouldn't park there. It could be a green line, it could be no line at all, but it works as a kind of language that those people who are culturally proficient in reading the system of road signs understand that they shouldn't stop there. And in just the same way we can think about a traffic light, there is no reason at all why green should be chosen as the colour that makes you continue to drive when you reach the traffic lights, or indeed that red should make you stop. These colours are arbitrary signs. The sign is the colour that makes you do to respond to that sign. In a similar way, we could think about an animal such as a dog. Now, there is no reason at all why D-O-G, that spelling, those letters, or indeed the sound dog, should refer to a four-legged creature who's furry with a wagging tail. And yet in our system of language, that sign, we could say the sign D-O-G, those letters, for example, is a sign which means four-legged furry creature, but to a Japanese speaker that would be meaningless. So that is a particular sign, but another kind of sign that we might see, which a Japanese speaker, for example, or a Chinese speaker or anybody else might recognise, is, and I'm just going to try and draw it for you. And just whether or not you can see that sign is an image of a dog's head poorly drawn. Now, that too is a sign just as much as this one is a sign. They both refer to a four-legged creature. Now, this kind of sign that actually looks similar to the object to which it refers is what we call an iconic sign, because it is recognisably similar. It isn't an actual dog. Clearly, it's just some lines drawn on a page. Whereas this is what we call a symbolic sign, because it doesn't directly refer. So the sign then is the thing which refers to something which we recognise in our culture. And where signs become interesting is where we can recognise that they are culturally specific, because it shows us that there is no close relationship between a sign and the object to which it refers. And an example that I always find quite amusing to cite is the sign that we quite often see if we are going on the London Underground, that dogs must be carried on the escalator. Well, probably when you see that sign, if you come from Britain and you're used to going on the Underground, you won't look at it twice. You would realise that what that sign's telling you is that if you have a dog with you, you must carry it on the escalator. But if you were from a different culture who didn't kind of know the rules of travelling on the London Underground, and you saw that sign, but you were able to translate the language, you understood the components of that dogs must be carried on the escalator, and you translated that back to your Russian, say, you might be worried about going on that escalator without having a dog to carry, because you would have a certain understanding of that word must, meaning a command that you should do this. So signs are the way in which we read culture.
So can you just elaborate on the difference between the signifier and the signified?
Okay, yes. Now this is quite a complex and abstract issue, because if we think about the sign, it is made up of two components. The sign itself has two ingredients. One's called the signified and the other's called the signifier, and these are quite difficult terms. Now, if we think about that sign D-O-G, we could say that is the concrete sign, the marks on the page, or the sound dog that I'm making. Either of those two things, or indeed the image of the dog itself, these things are the sign. The concrete physical part of that you can see is what is called the signifier. So this is a signifier, and it points to our understanding of a four-legged furry creature. This is a signifier. Indeed, it also points to our understanding of a furry four-legged creature. So it's the part of the sign that points to something. It's pointing to, in this case, is pointing to an actual four-legged creature, like a dog. Now, the thing it is pointing to is the signified. So the part of the sign that points is the signifier, and the thing it points to is the signified. Now, an example that's often given in textbooks to show how one signifier can point to a variety of signifieds is, I think, quite a useful way of describing this, and that is the example of the rose. And you'll find that in many textbooks. Now, if we think about a rose, of course, the signifier for a rose can be many things. First of all, it can be a drawing of a rose, it can be an actual picture of a rose, it can be the rose itself. But if we think about what that concrete part of the sign might be pointing to, it can be a variety of things, because if that rose is on a football shirt, that signifier is pointing to a signified, which is a national branding for football. I think that's right. The English football sign, okay, would be rugby.
I was just thinking.
So, you see, I've got that wrong. You have to be culturally proficient. And I'm clearly, from that example, not culturally proficient in sport. So I got it wrong, which is a really good example of the way the signifier points to a signified only if the person reading that signified understands the language. So you would need to understand the language of the representation of the rose in sport. Now, if you had a different kind of context that wasn't a football shirt, for example, maybe a frilly looking card, you would know that the signifier rose in this case is pointing to a signified which means love or passion, perhaps in the context of a Valentine's card. So we begin to see the way in which one signifier will point to a whole variety of different signifieds according to the context. The sign is the same thing, it's the rose, but it can have a variety of different signifieds. So for semiotics, it's always incredibly important the context in which you actually see that sign. So it's no good just reading for one meaning. You've got to look at the context and the possibility of the variety of meanings or signifieds to which the signifier points, which depends on the cultural context. I just want to come back to and my example of dog here, still thinking about the signifier and the signified. If you say the word dog, now you say it in your head, dog. Okay. In your mind, I guess that you've got an image, and it will be an image of a dog, and it's quite likely that that image is going to be a particular dog that you know. And the image in your mind is almost certainly going to be a different dog to the one I've got in mind. They will probably all have 4 legs and a furry tail and maybe hopefully a shiny nose, but your dog is different to mine. So when a sign is pointing in this way, when you have something signifying dog, everybody's mental concept will be unique to them. And that will always be the case, and it will depend always on your own experience.
Okay, so what do we mean then by denotation and connotation?
Well, in culture, unless we had some kind of agreement about the meaning of signs, we would never be able to communicate with one another. So it's important that when I say dog, we all have the idea of a creature with 4 legs and a furry tail that is specific to that kind of animal. And part of this cultural consensus is the way we are brought up to have this shared understanding of language. Now, Roland Barthes, who I referred to earlier, tried to take the idea of this shared language a little bit further in his thinking for media and cultural studies, when he showed the way in which in our cultures there were collections of meanings around particular kinds of signs. And when he tried to describe the idea, this pointing, the relation of the signifier to the signified, an alternative term he used for this pointing action to say that the signifier signifies something is to say that it denotes something. It's an easier way of describing it. So when we say that the sign denotes something, when we say that the sign dog denotes a 4-legged furry creature, it's the same thing as saying it signifies. the saying as the signifier signifies something, we can say that it denotes, it directly points to something in a very direct way. Now, using the term denotation or denoting is the first easily understandable meaning for a sign. But it gets much more interesting when we move beyond that to think what might be the connotations. But before we move on to say that, to come back to the idea of denotation, that something denotes something, it is again very culturally specific. If we see the sign of a black cat, for example, in our culture, in British culture, we might well think of the black cat sign as meaning lucky, or there could be any other kinds of lucky charm signs you might think about. But if we saw that sign in the Netherlands, it's actually connoting, has these cultural associations around a bad omen. So this is where Barthes brings our attention to how vitally important it is to understand the way in which certain culturally specific understandings of language work in certain places.
So what's meant by myth then?
Well, this is exactly really what I've been describing in terms of the way certain signs have connotations. Because when those connotations, for example, black cat is lucky in Britain, black cat sign is a bad omen in the Netherlands, when those become part of our acceptance so that we no longer question, they've entered into our kind of cultural value systems and understandings in a way that means we don't question it, then we can say they take on the status of myth. An example that occurred to me yesterday, because I was trying to explain to a child why a particular joke was funny which referred to the Irish. And it made me realise that a child hasn't yet learnt one of the myths that pervades British society, at least, and is present in jokes, that the Irish are somehow less intelligent than the rest of the population. And when you have to explain the Irish joke to a child who hasn't yet learnt that cultural value system and that understanding of the myth of the Irish as being less intelligent, when you realise just how much this myth has pervaded our society. So really that is an example of myth, and one of the very negative ways in which myth operates in our society is through this idea of stereotyping. That certain ideas about people that arise in stereotypes have entered into culture as a kind of myth, that people believe it really without questioning. And that is the way that myth has its status, and that I'm sure you can think of many other examples.
So why do you think mode of address is important?
It's very important to, when you're a student of media and cultural studies, to recognise the importance of mode of address, but really we should all recognise the way we're being addressed. For example, I'm addressing you now in a rather lecturing mode, trying to explain these rather abstract ideas around semiotics. And perhaps, that particular way I'm addressing you is inviting you to have